Okay, welcome to the forum today. This is the fifth lecture in our series In the Spirit, Christian Reflections on the Entity Dilemma, with Dr. Signi Goldman today, who is inviting us to consider what Christians can learn from shamanism. My name is Megan Holloway, and I'm the Director of Education for Ligare. I'm also joined here today with my very dear friend and colleague, Alyssa Jomay, who is our Director of Spiritual Care. And I think that Hunt Priest might be calling in from a plane somewhere. I'm not sure.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's not going to be with good internet, but he's our founder and director of community engagement. Um, and also on the call are several members of the Ligare community, many of whom are trained as spiritual directors. Joy, who I was just talking to, if you were in the intro, is one of them. Therapists, clergy, all kinds of medical professionals, all manner of healing modalities are represented in our community, as well as regular folk, regular Christian folk who are faithfully trying to understand their psychedelic experiences, as well as folks who identify as more interfaith, or who just count Christianity as one of the sources that guide them in and on their path. So I just encourage you, if you feel interested or drawn to join our community, one, know that you're very welcome to do so. We have an online platform where people can connect more directly with each other, ask questions, find others who are on similar paths. Um, and more than likely, you will find someone who very much aligns with your own path, as well as folks who are different and may have something to offer. And you can do that by going to our website at ligare.org. You'll find the link to click to join the community pretty easily. Let me open with prayer, and then I'll introduce Signy a bit further before I hand it over. Let us pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you once healed a blind man by spitting on the ground to make mud and putting it in his eyes. Let we who follow you never be put off by strange and earthy pathways to healing, remembering that you are the author and source of all energies in medicine and the wisdom required to use them skillfully. Help us recover our own authentic access to Earth's medicine, even as we seek to be good allies and friends to our Indigenous neighbors who have long been their stewards. Bless our time here today that it may contribute to the renewal of faith and to the work of repair in our world. Amen.
Mm.
So, a little bit about Dr. Signi Goldman. She is trained as a rites of passage guide and shamanic practitioner. She is also a board certified psychiatrist and psychotherapist and has been a psychedelic psychotherapy provider since 2017, owning one of the longest running clinical psychedelic practices in the US. She was the founder and former lead trainer for the Living Medicine Institute's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy training program before transitioning to her current practice, where she teaches and mentors mental health providers entering the field. Her knowledge of ceremonial rites of passage and shamanism informs both her teaching and her clinical psychedelic work. And I just want to pause here to say it is a truly special thing here to be to have someone with this kind of wisdom in both the depths of shamanic tradition, the depths of rites of passage and nature-based work, uh, and a very well-trained medical professional and psychotherapist, and who really has, throughout her career and deeply within her person, sought to integrate the knowledge and wisdom from all of these traditions and knowledge systems. So, Signy, I'm just super grateful and always feel like I have my heart quickens when on the rare occasions we get to talk. I wish you weren't on the other side of the country, but really grateful for your steadfastness in this field to hold fast to the clinical truths and not let the deep wisdom get shadowed and put to the wayside. So, Signy will speak for about an hour, And then we'll transition to Q&A. And during the lecture, please refrain from using the chat for chatting or commentary. However, if you have a question that comes up during the lecture, absolutely feel free to put that in the chat. That'd be really helpful to me and Signy. We'll have a good record of questions in the order that they appeared, and we'll get to them at the end. You'll also have the option to unmute and just raise your hand, your digital hand, and ask your question directly. So you can do one or the other, and both are fine. I just ask that to remember to keep your questions brief and focused so that we can get to as many questions as we can. To make sure that the question is really a question, and that it makes it easy for our guests to hear what the question is. So focus on the question part, and yeah, and that's it. That's what I need to say about that. I'll remind you when we go to Q&A. And so with that, Signy, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for all those lovely things that you said and the prayer in the introduction. I'm here because I do live at a very strange interface of psychedelics, clinical therapy, mental health treatment, shamanism, um, and where those things meet. And I think, I'm part of this series on the entity dilemma because one of the places where those things meet is entities or beings that appear to people on psychedelics, and the fact that we as a kind of collective culture don't really know what to do with that. Um, so I'm going to speak really just for myself because there's so many different viewpoints out there, and I'll share my particular views, my particular story from the lens that I have, like kind of living at that intersection. And some of this may bump against the edges of people's comfort zones sometimes. So I really honor Ligare for holding these conversations because I think we're talking about places where we don't have clear solutions or even clear definitions and answers yet. We just have a lot of questions and we're observing a lot of phenomena. And so I'm really grateful to be here just sharing in the conversation around what's emerging and what we're observing. Right now, as you guys probably know, psychedelics are happening in the psychotherapy world already. So, in mental health clinics like mine, there are trained therapists that are using psychedelics to assist with psychotherapy. I think there's some on this call that I saw, and it's a growing thing. It's already legal with certain substances, and it's happening in a city near you, if not a neighborhood near you right now. Um, and people on psychedelics often see entities, what we're going to call entities, and I'll talk a little bit more about like what that might mean and the ways that that can show up. And to the extent that therapists want to know what to do in those situations, we certainly don't learn that in therapy school or like medical school, both of which are things that I did. And so a lot of times, my observation of just looking around collectively is that we collectively have turned to shamanism to understand how to work with these phenomena when they happen. We have not turned to the church. And there's a lot of reasons about the ways that the role that church plays in people's lives these days, or the way it plays in like the idea that, you know, there's what is the authority source for talking about these things. So though Christianity has wisdom traditions around this kind of thing, we have really distanced ourselves from them in the modern world. And so I think most people that I know are turning to what I'm going to collectively call or roughly call shamanism to understand what to do when you're actually in a room with a client on a psychedelic who is experiencing some sort of spirit world phenomenon. So is this ideal? I don't know, but this is what's happening. And so I'm here to kind of talk about that, what I'm observing and what the implications might be. Um, so I have a strange job. I have a weird job, according to like probably for a lot of you. So I'm hoping it also just gives you a chance to hear from someone who's doing this clinically and what it's actually like. So one of the first things I want to talk about is what is shamanism, since I keep using that word. Um, it's an unfortunate word, really, because it doesn't mean anything in particular. It has come to be associated with a sort of collection of beliefs, traits, and practices. But it's not a clearly defined word. the word itself is actually appropriated from a particular indigenous culture, but the way it's used nowadays is to describe like a broad tent of people under that umbrella term that are operating under different traditions and different wisdom teachers, different teaching lineages that have some things in common. So I sort of think about it, unlike sort of the a lot of the religious traditions in our world that have institutional hierarchies associated with them, shamanism never has had that, does not have that. It's a very grassroots, ground up, more spiritual phenomenon. There are many, many shamanisms. They're all over the world on every continent, and they've always been there. And we believe going back into probably the mists of time, most indigenous people, all of our ancestors operated in a shamanic way in their understanding of the spirit world or of spirituality. So it's a very anciently rooted way of operating, but it's also morphed a lot. And the modern version is not the same as the ancient version in many ways. There are shamanic traditions on certain continents and in certain cultures that are very culturally defined. And then there are streams, especially in the West today, that have like sort of merged out of some of those larger traditions. And there are people who are in direct teaching lineages. Um, and there are people who've learned from multiple teaching lineages and then started new teaching lineages. So the reason I'm saying all that is because I really like the image I get when I think about the wisdom traditions that have come down through what we're calling shamanism is like the water systems on our planet, the rivers and streams. Like there's broad rivers that have been solid and been there forever, and then there's streams that branch out of those, and sometimes streams merge back in with each other. There's little side rivulets. Sometimes those merge in large, and the sort of teachings of shamanism look like that. If you put 20 shamanic practitioners in a room, they may be doing some very different things from each other, and there may be actual places where they disagree with each other. So there isn't a sort of authoritative institutional source of authority, right? And that's because one of the core tenets of shamanism is direct access to what Christians will call revelation, direct experience of the divine. And you are called directly to interact with your guides or your helping spirits who are understood to work for God or Spirit, Great Spirit, Holy Spirit. And it is a sort of direct you are a student of and direct partner with these spirit guides. So your access to that is very individualized. So if you work with a teacher in shamanism, what they're teaching you to do is to get in touch with that for yourself. And so they're never a shamanic teacher will not tell you what your source of authority is or what you should or shouldn't be doing. They will tell you to talk to your guides or your helping spirits. So it is unlike a lot of modern organized religion, it is a really direct access phenomenon. So there's no central authority, and it has this direct revelation authority structure. It's also all the shamanic traditions. So shamanism, we can broadly say one other thing that people have in common is it involves altering one's consciousness to access these ways of interacting with the spirit or the spirit world. So it's altered consciousness work, altered states of consciousness. And you can see some of that traditionally was done with psychedelic substances, but there's many, many other ways one can alter one's state of consciousness, and that's been the case all over the world in the shamanic traditions. So there's a belief in the spirit world for shamanic practitioners, and a interfacing with that spiritual world. And there is an understanding of the spirit world being both helpful and harmful, having both helpful aspects and harmful aspects, and traditional teachings to for healing or for dealing with both those aspects. Shamanism is not a religion. It's really a set of practices for working with one's spirit guides. But if most people who practice in shamanic traditions are animist. So you would think of animism as the religion that is associated with a shamanic practitioner. And animism, for those of you who don't know, I think a lot of you would, is sort of the belief that everything has a soul, plants, animals, that all, we're surrounded by many, many beings. They have their soul, they have souls, and that they have sentience. So a lot of what a shaman is doing is using their own, altering their own consciousness to interact with the sentient souls of the other beings, both in this world, plants, animals, etc., and in the spirit world, or the other worlds. So, you know, sounds really ancient. It sounds like old ancient stuff, and yes, it is. But there is a very, very wide and growing shamanic group of people or shamanic variations of shamanic teachings and faiths that are happening in the modern world. And it's interfacing a lot with people who are in the psychedelic psychotherapy world, which is partly why I'm here to talk about it. Um, there's a concept, neo-shamanism, which is often used to refer to like sort of the modern Western version of shamanism. There's a concept called core shamanism, which was introduced by a researcher called Michael Harner several decades ago. And the idea of that is taking the altered state techniques that are used across many, many cultures all over the world in common, looking at all of the different shamanic cultures, which often are distinct to a particular cultural tradition. What are the things that they're doing in common all over the planet that can be pulled out? That's called core shamanism. So people like myself who nowadays have shamanic practices, we're very influenced by things like core shamanism as well, because I'm not in a traditional cultural lineage, that I can't claim a particular cultural lineage that's had a shamanic tradition going back hundreds of years. So it's a very loose and messy word. It means different things to different people. It's not ideal, but we're going to use it because that's the word that we use, and we don't have a better one. And then the last thing I want to say is that shamanic wisdom traditions have exorcism traditions. The word exorcism isn't really used, mostly because that word has really been associated with Hollywood and fear in the modern world in our recent times. So the word that you will run across is depossession. But most shamanic teaching lineages have depossession teachings, and that is, exorcism. So that's why we're here today. There are differences for sure between shamanic depossession techniques and the ones that are often um, taught in the Christian traditions. And I realize there's multiple Christian traditions that they don't all agree either. But there are some distinct differences that I'll get into if we have a little bit of time. So I am a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, and I was that first before I was a shamanic practitioner. So I really did have to step into a very new and different way of learning and seeing the world in order to become a shamanic practitioner. And I don't have time for that story today, but I'll just acknowledge, just to be authentic, that that's not an easy transition. Like all of us that grew up in the West, and especially went to medical school and went as a science-based background and all of this, I very much it was very hard for me to shift the frame of reference it to something that seemed so non-scientific and so spiritually, you know, woo, strange, right? Um, and so I don't have time to tell the story today, but I will just go ahead and say it wasn't not an easy thing to be able to learn that very different way of being and operating. Because I had initially come into mental health treatment through the sciences, right? Or not through a spiritual understanding of it. So now I have this foot in both worlds, and sometimes I find myself in these strange, surreal moments, like this moment where I'm kind of like attempting to translate between these two very different ways of understanding the world, or be a bridge, or sort of create some communication between them. And it's important for me to say that I can only speak for me. There may be other people in this interface that wouldn't agree with what I'm saying. So these are my experiences and my story and the things that have happened to me as someone at this interface. I certainly can't speak really for anyone else. This is a really strange and mysterious world that we're standing in here. So why did I do this? Why did I become a shamanic practitioner? I was called. I had a spiritual call to it, and I kind of struggled with that. That's part of the story. But I do think now that I had that call partly because I was a mental health practitioner working in psychedelics, and people experience entities in that context. So in my office and every day, not every, these sorts of things are happening. And I think without learning shamanism, I would have been at a loss for what to do when something like this showed up and how to help someone. So today, like in my office, if someone is on a psychedelic and they experience an entity, often a benevolent one, but say even a malevolent one, there's really nowhere else to go. We can't really go to the churches, even if the client is Christian, which they are not always. But even if they are, if they go to talk to their pastor or their priest about it, vast majority of the time they don't know what to do with it either. So we are there. There's a need. There's a need for something bigger and better than me holding that, or those of us that are in me. But so I'm naming just what I'm observing right now. So for me, learning or the shamanic teachings kind of filled that gap, but I think there's this opening for Christianity to be part of that conversation more because Christianity has these traditions and had them, even though we've distanced from it a bit, or Christianity's distanced from it a bit. So nowadays, most psychedelic psychotherapists who are willing to step into this conversation at all are either learning from the shamanic traditions or they are learning through IFS, internal family systems, as a branch of psychotherapy. And we may have time to talk a little bit about that more, but internal family systems is a modality that, if you study it at its higher levels, comes from shamanism and is a way of sort of using shamanic depossession techniques without calling it that. With sort of the language is a little more palatable in a mental health space. But everyone knows that that's what's going on, including the the people that are doing that. I find that that's just a really fascinating piece. So most therapists are either going that route or they're going into like t getting some training in shamanic like depossession or other kinds of techniques. So that's just letting you guys know what's going on the ground for those of you who aren't psychedelic therapists. So I want to talk a little bit about my understanding of Jesus as shamanic. And this is just me talking here, nobody else. So I don't speak for anyone else. And when I say Jesus was a shaman or may have been a shaman, I am not saying he was merely that. But for me, Jesus being a shamanic practitioner does not take away from the fact that he may also have been the Messiah. So this is not saying only. But for someone who is steeped in shamanism for decades and the sort of anthropology side of it, as well as the actual practice side of it, when I read the Gospels, I see a lot that sounds really, really familiar. And so, speaking for myself, I'll just say a little bit about that in case it's interesting to anyone before we kind of go forward and talk about the what does all this mean. Um, for me, one of the things that I recognize a lot in Jesus is it is not me. He says often things like, it is not me who does these things, but my Father through me. In other words, there's this understanding that the ultimate source of power is coming through him, through the Father. And these words are not mine, but come through me through the Father, or this power is not mine. And that's a really kind of shamanism, a classic belief in shamanism. And sort of one of the reasons that I stepped into becoming initiated into shamanic practice is because when you are dealing with a spiritual phenomenon on behalf of another person, like in a healing context, it's incredibly important that you understand that you do not have the power to do anything. The power comes from God, or it comes from the higher power that's standing behind and working through you. So what you're training yourself to do is to be in relationship with that higher power. And there's a lot of language in the Gospels about that, about like it's coming from behind through me, see something greater than me. It's a shamanic stance. So for me, I've always recognized that. Um, Jesus is fasting in the desert for the 40 days and 40 nights and the temptation. And this is a really sort of classic shamanic initiatory experience all over the world. Going out into the wilderness and fasting is on multiple cultures and going very, very old traditions and then going through an ordeal, a spiritual ordeal. Afterwards, you come into relationship with helping beings. And these helping beings are understood to work for whatever you understand to be God or the higher power, and to help you be in service of your people through that. And so, the way the Bible describes Jesus going through that ordeal and then the ministering angels arriving and afterwards him being attended by these ministering angels is actually sounds very much in alignment with the kinds of shamanic initiatory experiences that people describe all around the world, where the helping spirits which is another translation for that, arrive and now are there to assist you in your work, understanding that your work is in service of your people. And some of that is healing work. Could also be other kinds of things like teaching. Um, and, the Bible does imply that these angels continued to be in relationship with Jesus. I know, like at Gethsemane, for example, when he was needed courage. Um, when Jesus was arrested, and he said if he needed to, he could call in legions of angels that could rescue him, as he went, with the understanding that he went willingly because he had access to this kind of assistance. Those things, when you are a shamanic practitioner, those things feel very familiar in a shamanic model. So there's a lot of use, as was in the prayer that started this hour. There was a lot of use of spittle, mud, kind of sort of like what is shamanic healing techniques that were specific to the culture at the time, that I recognize when I'm reading things like that. There's examples of healings that are partial and then have to be continued, or that rely on the faith of the other person to a degree, right? If a person doesn't have faith, it can't work as well. These are things that really make a lot of sense in a shamanic context. Um, Shamanism understands that you can alter your consciousness and communicate with deceased ancestors or teachers. One's teachers and so something like the Transfiguration in the Bible reads to me as pretty shamanic, as someone who's immersed in shamanism. And then lastly, there's a lot of exorcism in the Bible and a lot of what we call deep possession. Um, and I think a lot of people today read that as this sort of good evil, like the possessing beings are evil. Um, but I think if you actually read it in its original language, there's a distinction of there's different types of beings that can possess people. Often they're using the word unclean, or like a spirit of sickness or a spirit of infirmity or something that was on the person and got taken out. So, it's there's a possibility there, even in the reading of scripture, for there being different kind of types or degrees of beings or entities that can make someone ill. Though that's never really, you know, elucidated much. But in shamanism, that would be an understanding. So I can talk a little bit more about like what modern shamanism, to the extent that it is an umbrella term, would understand about all of that. Um, so let me move on to talking about the kinds of things that I see in my practice as a psychedelic therapist, because this is often one of the things I get asked. Like, what kinds of spiritual experiences are people having in a modern, Western, non-Christian, non-religious container? So the first thing I want to say is that we, I've talked a lot about my role in shamanism because of getting trained in that. But in my clinical office, most of the people that come into my clinic are not coming in in a spiritual frame at all. The clinic looks like an ordinary clinic. I'm dressed in my sort of business casual. There's nothing in the room that has spiritual, uh, there's no spiritual things around the room. There's no language at all suggesting that this is going to be a spiritual experience, because we're running this. This is a mental health clinic. We're seeing people from all walks of life, and that's not what they're expecting or asking for, and that's not what we're gonna show up as. So we're not
Spot
suggesting
on.
we're not suggesting
Connected.
everyone will have a spiritual experience. We're just suggesting that they will have hopefully a therapeutic experience, and we're there as a role as a psychotherapist. So psychedelic psychotherapy practices what's called the non-directive approach, meaning we are very much trained not to steer or direct the clients in any way. So what I observe in my clinic is things that are spontaneously showing up for people. It's a pretty bland office kind of setting. The first thing I want to say is that spiritual entities or even spiritual experiences do not happen for everyone. So let's first get that out of the way. A lot of people come in for psychedelic psychotherapy and get a lot of benefit from it, but don't experience it as spiritual. And the majority of people don't have what I would call entity encounters. I've never counted, but I would say maybe 40% of people do in my practice spontaneously have those. I do think that if you are in a cultural context where the psychedelic is given in a religious context, are much more likely to have that happen, because there is this phenomenon called set and setting that some of you may be familiar with. And that's a talk for another time. So let's say 30 to 40% of people that I see will spontaneously have a spiritual experience. By far the most common one is a non-specific God encounter. This would be feeling the presence of God, universal love, compassion. It's often incredibly moving feeling. This is a thing that is sort of people will use the word God. Some people will specifically see deities. Some people will specifically encounter Jesus or deities from other religious traditions. Often, in my experience, these are religious traditions the person has some knowledge of. So I don't tend to see someone who has never experienced anything from some tradition all of a sudden see a deity from that tradition. That's not as likely, but I do have people who will have deities or spiritual beings that they have heard about or are aware of in the culture all of a sudden kind of show up in ways that they didn't expect, but it's never something they've never heard of before. Most people who are Christian have pretty Christian themed experiences, but they're not necessarily Orthodox Christians. Sometimes they have things that they weren't expecting in there. Um, People who are Jewish often have Jewish themed, but there's a lot of just experience of God, whatever that is for that person. I would say that to me is the thing that happens the most often. But closely followed by that, quite often people experience deceased family members, ancestors. These are very vivid encounters with someone. Sometimes they're teachers or influential people or ancestors. Sometimes they're people who have not passed that are far away that show up, but very often it's people who are deceased. I've talked about deities, different spiritual figures, and other kinds of spiritual beings. These can be animal and plant spirits. And again, these are kind of things that spontaneously happen. Helping animal spirits show up kind of often. This can be like fierce or strong animals that are like teaching the person or helping the person feel the sense of strength or power. It can be beings that wrap around or shelter a person, who allow a person to fly, take flight. Um, I'm just thinking of things that literally clients I've seen recently, like a sort of unspecified nature goddesses, like nature beings that don't belong to a particular tradition, but they will appear to the person and have some sort of interaction with them. And various other kinds of imaginary helpers or guide figures. Sometimes these guides are aspects like I self-identify as aspects of the person's self, like I am a part of you that you don't know yet. Sometimes they identify more like guardian angels. And so there is this open question about are all of these phenomenon aspects of the psyche, you know, archetypes that kind of are projections of the psyche, or do they have sentient existence outside of us? And that is an unanswerable question for me anyway. People fall in different places there, but I don't think we as humans really know the answer to that. Um, so usually these encounters are comforting or teaching. They usually contain, in my experience, a message from something that is healing or like a higher source message that brings people like closer in alignment with healing the thing that is causing their pain or their suffering. So they're almost always positive in that sense. But if we're talking about experiences that are negative or challenging, there are two kind of categories that I wanted to talk about today. The one that you would see most often in a clinic like mine would be someone who either feels they are possessed by something or obsessed by something. Those are distinctions I can get into later if you want, but there's some sort of negative energy or entity or something that's attached to them or around them or distressing them. It's less often for me that someone comes in with that complaint. What's more often happens is they get on the psychedelic and then they name that or that part shows up and self-identifies. Like, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. That would be the most common phenomenon. In other words, if someone is coming in already in distress, and when you're in the psychedelic therapy process, uh, a part or a entity that is within that person shows up and self-identifies as the source of the distress. This was the main thing that we'll probably talk about because this is where the conversations around depossession come in, or exorcism, and to use a more an older word. Um, but there is one other category of negative experience that I just want to say because as part of the broader conversation, and that is the phenomenon of having something malevolent or hostile enter into you in the first place. The vast majority of times that this category of thing comes up in clinical practices like mine, the negative thing, whatever we're going to call it at this point, has been with the person for a long time. Either they've been struggling for a while, or it's been with them since childhood in a sense that they didn't recognize it, or it's long-standing. And so that's the most common thing. However, there is a phenomenon, and it's important to name this because this is where a lot of fears, especially in Christianity, a lot of the fears come in about psychedelics making someone more um, malleable or more vulnerable to something coming into them. And this is a phenomenon that is observed most commonly not in clinics like mine, but in underground settings or environments where people are taking psychedelics in less safe containers. And by that, I mean the set and the setting. So, for example, if you go to the jungle somewhere in another country and you're doing ayahuasca with a whole bunch of people that you don't know and guides that may or may not be safe, and you're in a circle with a bunch of people with a lot of trauma, and you don't really know who's holding the spiritual safety of that container, which is, remember we talked about you can't do this work without some sort of spiritual authority that you're working alongside. What is the spiritual authority of that container? There is a widely observed phenomenon, and whether you want, however this lands for each of you individually, I can't say, but in the community that I live and move in, of many, many stories of people feeling like things come into them in situations like that. And that has to do with the safety of those containers. I have never in my clinic, my brick and mortar clinic in America, experienced someone having something coming into them. Um, Always what I've seen is this is a thing that they came in already struggling with, and it's on the psychedelic. We had to get in conversation with it. But I'm happy to answer questions if we have time about all of that. So I wanted to name that is kind of part of the broader conversation. So the what way that we are taught, the way that I am taught to work with entities, and in this case, let's talk about malevolent or harmful entities, is the way that is a form of shamanic depossession that is pretty much in alignment with what most shamanic practitioners would do. If there's shamanic practitioners on this call, you'll probably recognize this. Um, there are some variations, but mostly we're all doing the same things. And I would argue that I'd see a lot of this in the biblical accounts as well, though there's some reading between the lines because we don't really know. Um, and this is if you are a shamanic practitioner and you get trained in something called depossession training, this is what you're taught to do. And there is IFS, internal family systems pieces in here for providers that are on this call. I'm gonna light touch that right now because I don't want to overwhelm people with too much information. But usually what's happening is if this is going to show up, the person is on the psychedelic and a part of them um, either self-identifies or becomes identified by me and the client as the source of the distress, right? Or the source of the suffering that we're sort of working with. And we are in the in the sort of traditional, like in a church context, all of this, if this part identifies as being sort of harmful or malevolent, you would just expel it, you would command it out, right? That's traditional exorcism. In modern practice, because we do understand so much about trauma, a lot of the time, what you're first trying to do is make sure that this part that's speaking is not actually a traumatized part of the person themselves. So I'm going to say this again in a little bit different language. The first thing I'm doing is talking to this part and working on identifying whether it is actually a part of the person who has gotten very traumatized. Because if you have a part that's very traumatized, um, that part can be violent or antagonistic. A lot of people feel like there's something in me that's fighting me, or I'm almost fighting myself inside. Um, Self-hating. like just speaking very hatefully, trying to almost like destroy or tear down or harm the person. Um, that doesn't mean that it's coming from outside the person. It can be that that's a young, this often these are young child parts that are very, very traumatized, and the way they have survived is by becoming violent or self-attacking and things like that. And oftentimes that then needs healing rather than expelling. And so you have to be trained in knowing how to tell the difference. And if the part needs healing, then you're going into like a therapeutic parts work and you're doing trauma work in a therapeutic parts context to sort of integrate or heal that part or get that part out of that fear-based, that sort of like malignant coping style that it's adopted. And so for people here who are not clinicians, I know that might just be like a bit much, but that's the clinical side. However, if the part identifies itself as coming from outside the person or having inserted itself into the person at some point, then you're moving into depossession work. And then depossession work is first you're asking the part to identify itself. Um, some providers will ask it its name. You said Jesus do that at least once in scripture with I think it's the Gerasene demoniac, where like, what is your name, right? More often, the way I'm trained, you're asking it how long it's been there and where it came from. How long have you been with this person? Where did you come from? Like this. But once you identify that it's something outside the person that has inserted itself in, and oftentimes it will know where it came from or it will have a story, then you're explaining to it that it has to leave. Um, you can command it out. That would be like the traditional Christian exorcism practices. More often, what's happening in with people like me is you're negotiating it out, but you're insisting. And there is a concept in shamanism called compassionate depossession, which is the understanding that the possessing entity is often a suffering being itself and is not so much um, doesn't so much have harmful intent as is lost or confused. So sometimes what you're doing is explaining to the suffering being that it cannot be in this person anymore, but it needs to go somewhere else. But you're doing it with compassion. You're basically saying, we understand that you're suffering, but you can't be here anymore. So that's a little bit of a different stance than traditional, Christian exorcism typically takes. That is one difference. And then you are escorting the part out of the person. But when I say you're doing it, you're not doing it. You are at this point calling in your spiritual guides that you've been trained to work in collaboration with. So your helping spirits are coming in with you, and your helping spirits who are like, yeah, I guess you could think of them as angels. It's about words, different words. Words fail when it comes to this, right? But the helping spirits are assisting this being to be transported somewhere else. And in shamanism, it's understood that because this is a suffering being, they're usually going to a better place for them or a place where they can get healed, but they have to leave this human's body and this human's energy body. Um, then you are um, confirming with the client that they felt the shift. Like, do they feel that this thing has left? You're looking at their body language, you're looking at their emotion, you're checking with them, and you're asking and you're checking if they feel the shift of something coming off them or out of them. You're anchoring that in. And then what happens is you're giving them a kind of homework, which is like to maintain themselves in such a way that things don't come back in. And this is actually in Christian scripture as well, with Jesus saying, go now and do this, or go now and do such and such to kind of like maintain and take the space that is now empty because this thing came out and fill it with God or fill it with spirit or something divine, right? And there are practices you can do. Prayer and fasting is often recommended, even. And so in shamanism today, the kind that I'm in, the world that I'm in, you would then give someone homework that's about something like prayer and fasting that works for them, that's nutrition, that's about keeping something like love and light that's in that space rather than something that is malignant. Most negative or hostile entities that come into people in the shamanic understanding come in are often invited in or have openings accidentally created through trauma. So a lot of times there's trauma work to sort of to heal that and to make the person less vulnerable to that, and then spiritual pieces that are brought in. So so there is an understanding, and I think this is true around the world, that if you're removing something from someone, you do have to do the person then does need to do the work so that things don't get back into them. Just speaking like bluntly in that way. So I Christianity does have exorcism traditions. I'm not an expert on them. I know about them the same way any layperson would. Um, should therapists be trained in that? If they're Christian therapists, should people be trained in that for clients that are Christian? What should we be doing any of this at all? If we don't do this, then what happens when something like this does show up with a person? These are all questions I can't answer for any of you. I'm just saying that this is what's swimming around. But I do want to talk about a couple of distinctions that I make or that shamanism makes between that's different from Christian exorcism traditions, if I can put those under one umbrella term right now, which I know is already a little artificial. There are many Christianities. One, in shamanism, possessing entities or possessing beings or energies are not necessarily evil. There's not such a good evil dichotomy. It's more like they're harmful to your health. That's a little different from evil. It's almost sometimes they're thought of as like the way we think about like a bad viral illness or a bacteria. Like it's not evil, but it can make us really sick. So we need to heal it and get it out. That does not give it evil intent. Um, an analogy that's often given is like, you know, if you walk into the woods and you get bitten by a snake, is the snake evil or did you bump up against a snake and that's what they do? So like a bacteria or like so there's an assumption that these things aren't healthy for us and they can get into us in a kind of parasitic way, but they may not have evil intent or be per se evil. In fact, the vast, vast majority of them, when you're actually doing this, and this is corroborated by anybody out there who's doing it, are actually lost human souls or identify themselves that way or parts of it. So in other words, um, they're humans who got stuck and didn't know where to go, didn't go to the light, didn't know where to go, and they're in a state of like confusion, partial memory loss, and they've partially or fully attached to another person, often with like sort of unhealthy behaviors or unhealthy kind of influences. And getting them out heals the person from whatever mental or physical or kind of the sickness that they're experiencing, but the possessing entity is not necessarily evil in intent. It's more loss from the light, right? And so often there's a belief that by some providers will believe that when they're doing possession work, they actually have two clients. They have the physical client in front of them, and then they have the lost, the human that got stuck or lost, or partially stuck or lost, that they're also sending to the light, or sending to healing, or sending to God. And in the depossession world and shamanism, there is a lot less fear. Like I'm not in a Christian tradition, so I may be wrong about this, but my impression from the outside is that the Christian traditions, there's this sense that you fear the evil beings and that you do a lot to like protect them or like expel them. Like they're kind of the enemy. Shamanism, I would say, doesn't do that as much. It is true that there are like very malevolent beings, but most people that I've worked and trained with do not feel much fear because there's precaution, but there's not a lot of fear because there's an understanding that if you are that any of this work is being done through you by God, and God is more powerful than any of this stuff. And so if God is in the space or in the room, there is no fear. So the teachers I've had, they're just not really afraid of these entities. They're very just firm, calm. You have to leave, and they are working in collaboration with their helping spirits. So those spirits are powerful enough to like escort this entity out. So it's actually quite calm. Usually looks quite calm compared to things that people imagine, or certainly anything that you would see like in a Hollywood movie. It's just that's not the version that I've ever been around. So, um, let's see. Yeah, so different relationship with fear. I just wanted to make sure I said that. Um, So there is this emphasis, like the way I wrote it in my notes, says like versus shamanism, where depossession work is based on understanding relationship and mutual solution, that's the way I'd written it down, which is kind of true because you're often like negotiating with this part and saying you need to go somewhere else, but there's somewhere better that you can go, or we'll try to help you get somewhere better, but you've got to get out of this person. which is, a very different stance than uh treating the part as the enemy. So that's just that I'm just naming that. That's a phenomenon. Um, and then I do want to say, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, that shamanism as it is today has lots of branches that are somewhat Christian. And I don't know how much people are aware of that. A lot of actual providers on the ground come out of Christian traditions. And I feel like those conversations aren't had very much in the churches. So they're had like the people are bumping up against each other in shamanic communities and identifying as Christian. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that other than I just wanted to shine a light on the fact that this is a really diverse and kind of um, a world where a lot of our traditional hierarchical and institutional and like compartmentalized um, knowledge lineages are separate. It's not, there's a lot of mixing happening. And, in a way, I guess that makes sense because psychedelics are already a place where there are sort of ordinary world institutions and hierarchies and things like that get dismantled. And we are in psychedelic work walking into the non-ordinary worlds and spaces alongside of people. And it makes sense that our current ordinary world institutions don't really have wisdom traditions for that. And so it's inevitable, I guess, that we're reaching back in time. What did all of our ancestors do way back? And we are leaning back into those things. But it is also the case that we're not 100% sure what to do with it yet, because all of this is a somewhat recent phenomenon in our culture, this particular mix of stuff I've just described. So I'm not, by no means have I provided a solution or a prescription. I'm really just here like a field reporter letting you know what's going on out there and acknowledging that there are a lot of questions that this opens up that do not have answers. So I will stop talking for a little bit and see if there's any pieces of what I talked about that you guys want to ask specific questions about.
Signy, thank you so much for all of that. I have at least 10 questions myself, but I will not hog the Q&A. I'm going to start with one or two questions and just give people some time to formulate their own questions, and then I'll also go to questions in the chat and read those. So if you have a question that you want to ask directly, raise your digital hand and we'll go in order. And I'll also go to the chat as well in just a minute. Um, I think, maybe my first question, I do now want you to talk about these Christian shamans that you're bumping up
Yeah. No,
against.
I definitely can. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe specifically, in your experience, when you meet those people, what is it about their Christian faith that they have the whole smorgasbord, right? If they're doing shamanic practice, they could go anywhere. I'm sure they're encountering many different traditions, but what is it about Christian faith for those practitioners that feels precious and salient and worth keeping for them in their practice? Because it's a obviously broad question.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what their answers would be, but I'll say what I've observed as a phenomenon is that shamanic people in general believe that um, God, Great Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the sort of creator source being that rules everything and is the source of everything, that 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 God or source has many there are many orders and magnitudes of non-ordinary spiritual beings that work on behalf of God. Like angels would be an example in the Bible, right? But like different cultures. And that an individual shaman has his or her own helping spirits that have gotten in relationship with his or her during their initiation process. Like when you go through a shamanic initiation, you develop a relationship with helping spirits that you then rely on, and you understand that you guys are all working on this. It's sort of the same side. So if I'm doing shamanic work and I'm another shamanic person is there with me, I don't know who his or her helping spirits are, and that he doesn't know who mine are, but we understand that all of our helping spirits work for God, work for the same source. And so we're like, we're all on the same team. And so there's a respect of the of that person's guides. So if someone says to me, like, my guides are saying this, I'm not going to ever contradict that. I'm going to defer. I'm going to respect that because their guides and my guides are on the same team. As if I have to, it's kind of to put it in simple language. So usually, the culture is such that most providers do not identify who their helping spirits are. Um, because that has to do with the sort of sacredness of the relationship, right? And they communicate with your helping spirits by altering your consciousness in ways that you learn to do that. So all of that is to say that um, there's quite a few shamanic practitioners out there for whom Jesus or Christ is their primary helping spirit. And so they will do healings and do all of their shamanic work in through the guidance and relationship with Jesus. But because it's such a direct relationship, it's a little bit different from a traditional church-based Christian relationship with Jesus. And so I think, and some of those practitioners will also have other helping spirits. It's just that you got to realize they're all on the same team. So they don't experience a contradiction with that, and they don't question it because they experience those relationships as very real and authentic. So there are providers out there that are working with Jesus or with Christ and Christ. I mean, they may use those words differently, especially for healings and things like that. So
Thanks. And then I don't know if there's more to say about this, but you once said to me that there are these examples of Jesus showing up in indigenous shamanic practice, and sort of outside. And I don't know if that was more related to what you just spoke of, or if you're also seeing that.
yeah, I would say so. I've been in like healing circles and communities where you're the shaman person, the healer is not identifying as Christian, and the people that are there don't necessarily uh, identify as Christian per se, but Jesus shows up. Yes, I don't know if that's what you're asking, but so I think for someone like me, I understand this is just me. I understand that Jesus as a spiritual being that can show up when or if he chooses in many, many ways in different capacities. And sometimes um, he's the messenger that shows up. And sometimes, and especially in cultures that don't have as much awareness of Jesus on a cultural level, you will get other kinds of beings. And so if you're a shamanic practitioner, you believe that all of those are sort of valid messengers on behalf of God. So yeah, and you're sort of agnostic about preferences in a way, though I'm sure individuals are different. I can really only talk for me there. I think there's probably variation, even in the shamanic world there, but um yeah, I'll just say that. Sometimes they're in like we also have other kinds of deities or beings show up that I don't even know as well, that the person may know or may have heard of.
Thank you. Um, so we got a handful of questions in the chat. The first, what kind of psychedelics are you using in your sessions?
In the clinic, we are only using ketamine because of its legality. I'm trained in quite a few others. So in my sort of background and my life over time, I've been in this world that I'm talking about in the context of other substances. But in the clinic, we use ketamine in a specific way. We dose it in a specific way. And sometimes cannabis and ketamine together.
Okay, thanks. There's a question, can you recommend any books? That I could answer that question all day long, and we could only talk about books. So if maybe you have just a couple to recommend, and then I'm also happy to put together a list and send that out to our folks on our platform and in our next newsletter.
Um, it depends, I guess, on what, because I feel like I talked about a couple of things. Like there are books on things like depossession, from a shamanic lens. There are books by, if you're interested in like the IFS, internal family systems angle on this, there's books by someone named Bob Falconer who worked closely with Dick Schwartz, and it's kind of talking about depossession, like internal family systems as depossession work. So that's a name if you're interested in that part of it. There are certainly people who've written about the historical Jesus as a shamanic like figure. That's certainly not a novel idea. I don't know of one in particular, but ChatGPT could probably give you several. So it depends, I guess, on which piece of what I said.
I'll throw in the mix. There's a book that I enjoyed called Jesus, the Ultimate Shaman, and it's a much more practical approach. So it's not a scholarly work. There are plenty of those, and I'll make sure some of those get on the list. But it's written by some folks who did similar training to Signi, and but are writing and practicing from a Christian tradition. So I'll include that one on the list as well.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, there's a lot of books on shamanic healing modalities. So yeah, I'm happy. Maybe we can put together a list since I'm not sure exactly what the questioner is interested in.
We could make a very long list.
Honestly.
Yeah. Okay. If patients aren't experiencing, oh, sorry, my chat just got hijacked. There we go. If patients aren't experiencing a spiritual experience, how do you hold the balance between ethical and thorough preparation and informed consent and the intention to be non-directive?
If they are not having a spiritual experience. Well, this is a lot of people because I mean, ultimately, my primary job in the clinic, I'll just say a lot of what I do in the shamanic world is outside of clinic, right? It's different kinds of gathering communities, retreats, trainings, things like that. If I'm in the clinic and people are coming in for mental health treatment, I'm really doing psychotherapy. I am only moving into this space if it spontaneously starts happening for them. So most people that are not having a spiritual experience, we are doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, the way that I've taught and trained it to other providers over time. So it's therapy. There's a preparation phase where we kind of make sure there's a lot that happens in the preparation phase, making sure the person's ready to do a psychedelic journey and feel safe. And there's a lot of pieces that go into that. Then they're given a psychedelic, and by non-directive, it means that I'm not saying anything that steers them anywhere. I'm just helping them notice what's already happening for them spontaneously and mirroring that back and helping them check that. And a lot of times it doesn't go anywhere spiritual. It just goes more into therapeutic stuff, um, them understanding themselves better, seeing things that are helpful for them. And it's therapy. And then after the session, we do what's called integration, which is like an enhanced psychotherapy process where we're using the contents of the psychedelic journey and to make it therapeutic for the person. So nothing in there has to be spiritual at all. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. So when that's why I said when I was talking, like just I'm talking a lot about this kind of stuff, this spiritual and shamanic stuff, but for a lot of people, it comes up and it's not a thing at all.
Can I ask if it was actually my
Great.
question?
Yeah, please, Kristen, jump in.
Yeah, so thank you. The question was actually if a patient is not expecting a
Oh, not
spiritual
expecting.
experience. So this I have this question myself in my own works. It's a question that I'm holding right now. If we know that they very well may have a spiritual experience, yet we want to be non-directive in our work. How do we actually thoroughly prepare them for the experience, which may require some discernment, as we talked about in the last forum, and this idea of a real informed consent, because if you're preparing them for an experience they may not have, that can be directed. So it, do you,
Yeah, I have. So I'm going to answer that, and then I actually have a video where I teach this. So if somebody gives me your email or whatever, we figure that out somehow. I'll email you this video. But it's the short version for this moment is it is part of my informed consent process to say that some people experience things that feel spiritual to them. Like, so it's discussed in preparation, but it's not discussed like this is what's going to happen. It's like I go through a long list of things that people do tend to that might happen. scary experiences need to be discussed, right? All kinds of things like and things that like spiritual that may feel spiritual to you might happen. And so then we're usually doing some sort of exploration around like what their preferences are around that, what their comfort level is around that, what their expectations are around that. And I do a but it's a really short answer is there is a conversation that's like if then, like if this shows up, then what would you like from me? If this, what would you like from me kind of thing. Um, a lot of times this shows up first looking like parts work. You'll probably recognize this if you're a provider. And so the person tracks the whole time from this parts lens, and that becomes an avenue in that isn't too disconcerting to them at all because they're in the dialogue with the part at the moment that it's happening. I don't know if that's helpful or not. So yes, it's actually part of my informed consent, but it's phrased in such a way that it's not set as an expectation because the opposite thing happens. Some people come in wanting a spiritual experience and they expect a spiritual experience and then they don't get it. So you also need to prepare for that. So you need to explain like this may not happen to those people. So
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. And I'll share my email. I would love your lecture.
yeah, I'm happy to send it to maybe I could send it to Megan or whatever gets figured out here.
Kristen, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up. Rick, you can unmute.
Secondly, I add my thanks to Megan's for what you have given us today.
Thanks.
So thank you very much. I'm just curious about something. How is your shamanic posture received in the larger psychiatric world?
That's a good question. It's changing a bit. I used to be in the very beginning almost afraid to come out of the closet as a shamanic person. That's been quite a while ago now because obviously it's not psychiatry is a very science-based profession. So there are definitely people who don't think anything spiritual should be in the science of psychiatry, which I respect because it's a scientific discipline. Um, and so it's a mixed. Some people don't want to hear about it or aren't comfortable with it or don't think it's appropriate. And then other people are really hungry for it. And there's an increasing understanding that the dialogue needs to happen because psychedelics are on the scene. So before psychedelics were on the scene, I think it would have been a different answer. But now that psychedelics are being basically approved as mental health treatments, and everyone is acknowledging that, oh, we're giving people non-ordinary reality experiences here. We don't have any training in this as Western medical professionals. So now there's this obvious need for something. Now, is it shamanism? I don't know, but like something that's missing there. So I think there's a respect for the fact that we have to have some sort of dialogue, even if they don't agree with me or my ways of doing it. In the client population, there seems to be a hunger for something as well, and there's more openness than there is from other professionals, roughly speaking.
All right. There's a question here. Um, so a question here maybe, and this might go back to discernment, um, but could you share a little on what entity possession that appears to be the inner child presents as? We may or may not call that entity work, but maybe just to dive
Yeah,
into some discernment and parts, especially for if you're experiencing an inner child who might be wounded.
yes. This is not an easy place. Like I would say get training, a lot of training, because I had to learn this. But I think there's two kind of types of errors that are commonly made. One error is people who want to see everything through a psychological lens and say, no matter what shows up, it's part of the person. Let's just integrate it in. But if it is an entity, now you're doing harm. The other error basket, and I'm saying this to answer your question, but the other category of error is people who come from the other way. I think some of the churches do it this way. Like anything that seems to appear inside the person that seems sentient in and of itself, you need to get it out. Sometimes, though, that's actually part of the person's wounded child parts and you getting it out is now doing harm. So harm can be done. So the most important thing, and I didn't get into it in this talk because it was just out of the scope, is knowing the difference. So yes, a discernment part, or in my background, it would be differential diagnosis, right? It's just like a triage system. Like you got to identify first. And so a lot of what you're doing is identifying, because once you've identified, the intervention is actually not that complicated. The identifying is the complicated part. And parts can self-identify. So really what you're doing is you're creating the dialogue with the part. But a the places where it can get, I think, confusing when you're not as trained or in the beginning is that a part can show up, say, on a psychedelic and can start dialoguing with the therapist and can say, I hate the client. I want to kill them. I want them to kill themselves. I want to do harm. I'm making them do these harmful things. They have very violent traits or very destructive traits. And sometimes this is actually a very traumatized child part of the person, that this is how they survived, was to take on that. Like, so um, the answer is get trained so that you can learn how to tell the difference. And there is actually, you can get those teachings exist.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Maybe spend some time on this practical piece. You mentioned that there are precautions you take, and also some cautions around, what happens when we might go to South America and we're sitting with people we don't know. And I wonder if you might just have some recommendations for Westerners or Christians in particular, either way, about just what it means to practice good spiritual hygiene and preparation, spiritual
Yeah,
preparation.
I love this because I think it's so important. I think the problem with us as Westerners, modern Western people, because we have disavowed spiritual reality so much, is that now that psychedelics are available recreationally, we tend to go, oh, it's an experience. Let's go have the experience. The shamanic understanding is if you alter your consciousness without spiritual protection, you are making yourself vulnerable. So if I answer that question from a shamanic lens, it would be it it is totally, there are many, many wisdom traditions around altering one's state of consciousness for spiritual purposes through psychedelics, but also through other things. But you would only do that when you are prepared spiritually and you are under the guidance of someone who is working with helping spirits. So it's grounded in spiritual protection because you are opening up the other worlds, and some of the things in the other worlds are not healthy. So if you are just circling up with some people somewhere in the woods that you don't really know, getting on a psychedelic, you don't know the trauma that's there, you don't really know who the guides are, you don't know what the spiritual protections are that are in place, whether the guides are even doing that, and you're altering yourself, you, in a shamanic understanding, are creating a vulnerability for something to come into you, especially in circles where you have people have a lot of trauma and that's not being held. So in one of the I'm speaking to you guys today specifically in the little narrow niche of depossession, like because we're talking about entities. But another big part of shamanic training is how to create safety and protection in a container when you're doing healing work. And you do that with the assistance of spirit, right? And you don't do it like you as a human can't create that. So you need a relationship with spirit. That's a shamanic understanding. And that's also a Christian understanding, right? So you would do prayer, you would invoke God's presence, right? So if you're not doing that kind of thing, and if the guides and facilitators aren't doing that kind of thing, then yes, um, there have been many, many cases where people came out of those experiences feeling like something got into them. And this is what's one of the versions of what's called spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis. Like I've had some of those people come to me for, uh, after experiences like that. So, I guess one thing we should all keep in mind is that the psychedelic experience is not always healing and helpful. It's you're opening a doorway or a portal or something like so it's like you need to use it in a way that has a wisdom tradition that has taught you safety. If you really don't know what you're doing, you could open up to a lot of things. And that's not a modern Western, it's not an easy thing for modern Westerners to hear, but from as a shamanic practitioner, that's what I would say. Yeah.
I think I think it's really helpful. I was in a conversation recently with someone who their family members are much more conservative, charismatic, evangelical Christians. And they had a lot of concern about her participation as a psychedelic assisted therapist in that world, precisely because their concern is, well, you're opening yourself up. And she was asking me, how do I talk to my family members who are Christian and build a bridge? And my response to her was, well, maybe agree with them. That we may not need to be as paranoid as that group is. We might be able to remember we do have spiritual authority here. We are protected, and they're expressing, you know, concern about the potency and
Yeah,
openness.
I agree with some of her family's concern because I think we culturally right now, because we're so removed from these things historically, we underappreciate the necessity for safety. But in a Christian context, you would use prayer and you would invoke God's presence and you would not like go forward until you had done these things. And then you would not have be afraid because God is more powerful than any of these um, entities and things that are attaching to people. So it's not a fear-based place. But if you're not invoking a higher power or something that's stronger than you, and if you're just going out on your a little human authority, like if I just go out as Signy from down the street, this girl that went to medical school, and I'm like, I'm gonna field off that no, you can't like you're actually making yourself vulnerable, stuff can get into you. So I'm protected by something more powerful than me and that's how and then you're calling that in on behalf of your clients and so I wouldn't do as a participant I wouldn't do a psychedelic experience with a guide that wasn't doing that me so um I think what this person would do is develop what that safety needs to look like in a Christian context as a Christian and maybe one of the things we're talking about is that we don't have a lot of templates for that yet but we do because prayer fasting I mean we do there are but there's not a lot of um there's not a lot of place that Christian therapists can go to be like, what exactly do I need to do here? I think. I
And I
imagine.
love And I love that you brought up how well you know the community. I mean, certainly, the Christian community is the context in which we work out and express our faith. Like, we do it together. And so, even just knowing who you're sitting with and having relationships over time, having those bonds over time, is also another form of spiritual protection to be in deep relationship with people.
Yeah. And I guess one last thing I'll say is that in like these ayahuasca circles in the jungle or a lot of what's happening like in underground or recreational context, some of the danger comes from the other people. So just a reminder like that not everyone has positive intent or something like that. And that can get just like that can be in the field in ways that are kind of maybe out of the scope of today. But so yeah, that just reminded me to say that when you were like knowing an ethical facilitator would sort of be tracking all of that.
Yeah. You and I talked a little bit earlier about IFS and sort of the legacy there around spiritual authority and maybe the limits, but also the evolution of mental health practice right now. Sort of where are you seeing the limits of that traditional practice, and then where do you see that opening up? Maybe speak a little bit about the question of authority.
Well, I think IFS has done this interesting thing of bringing shamanic techniques into the therapy office without calling it shamanic. I would say some therapists out there might even object to me saying it's shamanic, but it is. There's just to dive a little deeper, or the person who created it, Dick Schwartz, has admitted that it came out of a shamanic tradition. So kind of combined with the understanding that the human psyche exists as parts is a pretty shamanic understanding, but it's now a accepted psychological understanding. So um, these some of these techniques have come in through IFS. I think what's missing is the therapist who is the provider in that context being grounded in a source of spiritual authority or safety. So and if you go learn those same techniques through shamanism, like I did, rather than through IFS certification, the very first thing you're going to be told is like, don't mess around with this stuff unless you have a relationship with helping spirits that's reliable and that you have spiritually or permission and authority to do this through your helping spirits. So that's shamanism. So don't mess around with it unless your helping spirits are in the room and they're the ones that are like holding down the safety and all of this. That's missing in IFS, but the techniques are coming in. So I find that interesting. Like, I guess I'll let the audience decide what they think about that for themselves, right? Because we were, there's probably different way or places people could land with what all that means based on one's spiritual beliefs.
There's a question from Allison, and I'm just going to ask her to unmute and say it.
Oh, thank you. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand.
No worries.
I just to like piggyback off all the things that you're saying about being grounded. I'm really grounded in Christ, and so I just wondered if you had any advice, like if you, with how things are, if you were wanting to pursue being like a leader and helping people. Um, would you pursue like psychotherapy, or is there anything like for Christians that you know of that's up and coming, or that you take the shamanism route as well? I'm just, yeah, wondering like if you have any advice or if there's anywhere that this is headed, like for Christians to be able to help other
Yeah.
people who are also rooted in Christ and want to experience psychedelics, and you would
Okay,
be a
yeah.
facilitator.
I think I understand the question. It's actually super interesting, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it, but I have some things, some thoughts. One is I feel like I think you're asking how can Christians help other Christians through depossession work in a way? And
Yeah,
'cause right now it's like you have to go through the church authorities, depending on which kind of Christian authority system you are under, and that may not be accessible. And it's not really, there are versions of Christianity that have lay exorcists, right? Which is kind of what the words that they would call. But I think right now, if you're not a therapist, you can't really practice IFS because that's under the therapy world. So I guess you would go and get depossession training through a shamanic practitioner and try to find one that is more Christian aligned or Christian open. But even the fact that you're asking that and the fact that the way I'm answering it shows us that something's missing here, like that
mhm,
really that this it doesn't exist is
yeah,
the fact that a Christian who wants to work with Christians would need to go get trained from a shaman is already like, wait, how did we get here?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, like,
given that, depossession work has deep origins in Christianity. And that's one of the things that's interesting about this moment in time. It's like Christianity had deep traditions around depossession or exorcism, lost them because of modern, cultural society. And now is like if you want to come back into it, all of a sudden it's not there anymore, and they're going over to the shamans to learn it. And I agree. I find the irony of that is like because
mhm,
I am the first to say that for a Christian wanting to learn to work with other Christians, I would love them to have a Christian teacher, more not me in a way, right? Like it feels like I don't have the authority to be that. So that I guess what we're naming is like something's missing here. Yeah.
Allison.
yeah,
Maybe
that,
that's why we're having this whole conversation.
well, and that's why I was wondering if you had any, yeah, any advice on that. Like if you wanted to become a facilitator at this point, you're saying to maybe do the shamanism route, depossession route in more of a Christ, because there is no
Yeah, there's no system in place.
facilitator training.
There's no system in place in our culture for like a lay people trainings, unless you're in shamanism side of things. And a lot of Christians aren't comfortable in the shamanism side of things because it's not a Christian context. And so that's kind of the irony of all this. Um, so I think we're missing that. And if you're not a trained psychotherapist, I wouldn't recommend doing IFS because that's kind of out of scope and you could bump up against things you don't know how to do. Um, So let's hold that as I don't know an actual person to send someone in your situation to, and I think that's maybe part of what we're talking about here. Um, but I have worked with shamanic teachers who identify Christ as their helping spirit. So there's things, so it wouldn't be for me to say whether that would be comfortable for you or anyone else. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
I wish it was easier answer.
Signy, thank you for all that you've offered today, all the wisdom, the anecdotes. It's always really helpful to hear, practical experience and what it's like to kind of be on the ground, but backed up by a lot of insight and wisdom, and obviously your own deep integration of this work. So, um,
Oh,
we have coming up, someone mentioned Santo Daime. I'm sorry, I'm just seeing this in the chat, as a bridge between shamanism and Christianity. And that is a perfect segue into the
yeah.
fact that next month, our, I think, sixth lecture will be with Bill Barnard, who is a scholar and a Daimista, a practitioner in Santo Daime with, I think, decades of experience in that tradition. Um, if you're not familiar, I'll include some background on Santo Daime so you can read ahead in advance of that lecture. But yeah, please come back and join us. It is a really beautiful expression of indigenous spiritualist contexts engaged with Christianity. Um, what else do I want to say? In Signy, you've reflected back, and Allison's question has reflected back to us that uh, the absence of the resources that we would want is reflective of the disunity of the church, that there are pockets and places where we can find some of this, and it's also not enough. So it's a sign for us who are still committed to life in the church to continue the work of recovering in unity. It matters. Now we see that we can't put it all together on our own. So, Signy, thanks for your time today, and look forward to staying in touch. And we will also get out a document with the next newsletter and then on the site of books, perhaps this video, if that's available, Signy, that you mentioned, or not. I'm not sure if it's
Yeah.
available.
You can loop back to me. I'm happy to get you that.
Okay. So look for that, and you can find all of the lectures we've had so far in this series on our YouTube channel. They are finally up and available. So if you have missed one, you can go find them there. Just Google Ligare and YouTube, and you'll find it.
Thank you, everyone.
Go in peace, everyone. Thanks for being here.